the Al-Maqaises are in Miami, the suitors are up in New York. And then Suitor is running his own operation with his wife, staffed by other Israeli nationals. And then 9/11, 2001. The World Trade Center towers are blown up. And at that time, a woman is standing in her apartment, and she sees outside her window a group of men observing the fall of the towers. And from her perspective, they don't seem to be sufficiently sad about it. They seem to be enjoying themselves. They seem to be joyous. So eventually, she calls the FBI. The FBI, sends out an APB, and these men are arrested. And they've been known ever since as the dancing Israelis, so-called. These men are arrested and under suspicion of having something to do with 9/11, because why else would you be dancing upon seeing the... Now, they didn't actually dance. That's just a label that's been affixed to them over the years. But apparently, they weren't expressing sufficient sadness. And I'm sad to say, if you actually understand the psychology of Israelis, you really wouldn't be surprised, because it's a not uncommon sentiment to learn of some terrorist attack in another part of the world and think, aha, now you finally understand what we go through. Good. So I'm not surprised that Israeli nationals would act in that way. It doesn't imply to me that they had any involvement. And in fact, they didn't. But their case wasn't helped when the FBI went to their offices of the moving company they worked for, and they found it a big balagan, and Suitor, the owner of that company, fled the country. Just left the offices as is, with things scattered all over, and he just fled to Israel, him and his wife, the owners of this company. So now the FBI is really suspicious. Could these men have had something to do with 9/11? And they interrogate them for the next few months. What they find is that it's extremely unlikely. They come to the conclusion they didn't have any foreknowledge. Yes, they drove to this apartment building because this apartment building has a gorgeous view of the New York City skyline. And from this apartment, they had a clear view of the towers. So once they'd heard that the towers are up in flames, they went out to this vantage point and they started taking photos there. Just like today, anyone would take up their camera, their phone, and take photos of anything that seems worthy of documenting. And they did the same. Now, eventually the FBI comes to the conclusion in its report. The FBI report is somewhat redacted, but it was published with a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request. And so we see that the conclusions the FBI came to, none of the Israelis had any information on prior knowledge regarding the bombing of the World Trade Center. Okay, the FBI is like, okay, well then what they were doing? Well, they believed that perhaps these men were Mossad, or at least one of them was Mossad, because why else would it? But no. They said what they probably were doing, if not arranging the 9/11 terrorist attack, they were probably spying on Arab Americans. I mean, it's no secret that the Israeli Mossad engages in espionage all over the world, and the FBI came to the conclusion that these men, or at least one of them, had been living in the US pretending to be a mover, but was in fact spying on Arab Americans in the New York City area. Well, since it came to that conclusion, I mean, of course they were upset, because according to the agreement between the US and Israel, Israel is allowed to have some intelligence operatives in the US, on US soil, but it's not, it has a specific quota of agents that it's allowed. And these men weren't registered with the American government. So the FBI was pissed. At the same time, it's 9/11. They got bigger fish to fry. They've got a massive terror investigation to carry out. And if these guys had nothing to do with 9/11, then yalla yalla, let's move on. And they eventually, a few months later, sent them back to Israel. Now, so this is the company they moved for. But if we read the texts of the FBI report that was FOIA'd, we see that what happened was, again, a combination of anti-Semitism on one side and philo-Semitism on the other side. What do I mean by that? These men were common criminals. They weren't Mossad spies, but because in some quarters there's a philo-Semitic assumption that, oh no, Jewish people could not possibly be involved in common criminal activity. No, if an Israeli national is doing something untoward, then they must be a Mossad agent. We know Israel's got the best spy agency in the world, so obviously they can't be criminals. No, they must be spies. But all the evidence was there. You just read it in the FBI report. And former employees and current employees of the company just explained it straight out. They said that the suitor and his wife, suitor was a crook. They would fill up the trucks with empty boxes because he would charge the customers by cubic feet. So they would, up the price. And some employees would stay on the trucks when they were weighed so that he could charge more. So he was a common criminal. And he employed Israelis who had no legal right to work in the US. By that way, he could pay below minimum wage and with cash as to avoid paying taxes and benefits. This is all from the FBI file. But they just ignored this evidence. Now, I eventually tracked down one of these dancing Israelis 20 years later. And I was able to ask him, and he confirmed for me. That was the Israeli system over there, the moving system. You start the move with one price estimate, and then you start to charge for everything. When it goes to storage, then the clock starts. If you don't pay, you don't get your stuff. So this moving company, owned by these Israelis and operated by these Israelis, they were running a financial scam and exploiting American citizens and holding their property as ransom, saying, okay, you hire us to move your stuff, but now if you don't pay us a much more inflated price than we originally quoted you at, we're going to keep your stuff and we won't give it to you until you pay our new asking price. And so that was the crime that he had committed over and over again. It's really obvious if you read the FBI report, you see that they were found on their person things like romance novels and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit in Hebrew. Like, this is not spy material. They were just Israelis who, after the army, decide to come here to make a quick buck, knowing that they can get by and work under the radar, and America's not going to do anything about it. And so they did. So at this point, because the FBI realized these scams were going on, realized that Israeli nationals were exploiting Americans, and enough Americans began to complain about this, the FBI said enough is enough. And so that they decided to conduct a sting operation and bust these criminals. So they're not going to do it to Souter because he's already caught and they've already allowed him to leave, and he's not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to have the proof to put him behind bars. So a couple of years later, 2003, he just moves back to the US, if you can imagine this. And now he's living in San Francisco with his wife. But in 2003, the FBI put together the information that they learned from interviewing and interrogating the dancing Israelis, and they busted Machias for that crime. The operation that was run out of the FBI office in Miami to bust these men was called Operation Stow. It was widely reported at that time, and this is how it worked, very, very simply, according to the FBI. So they would quote you saying how much it would cost to move your house, and they would quote you at a low price. Wow, that sounds really great. All right, I'm going to elect to order your services. But then on the day of, they would show up with a much smaller truck than they were supposed to. And they said, oh no, we can't move all your stuff. There's way too much stuff. Fine, okay, we'll move half of it here and we'll send another truck to take it to our storage unit, and then afterwards we'll send you the rest of the stuff. But once that was done, they demanded much more money. This was a scam they did again and again and again. And Machias was quoted as saying, you are fucking gonna pay for this or you won't get your fucking stuff. But eventually the FBI had enough of it, and they busted these mostly Israeli-owned companies, mostly Israeli nationals working for them. They arrested dozens of men, charged them And they could have gone away for a long time, 10 years, 15 years, or longer. These were serious charges of extortion. This wasn't a game. Machias himself, they put an ankle brace on him so that he couldn't flee the country, but they released him before trial. And wouldn't you know it, he comes to the court saying, oh, now my new job, I'm trying to go the straight and narrow. I'm trying to live an honest life, but every time a customer comes into the store, he sees this ankle on my, this brace on my ankle, and it turns them off, and please, won't you, sign this court order that will allow the removal of this ankle brace? And so they, I guess, felt some sympathy for him, and they ordered the removal of the ankle brace, and of course, like a minute later, weeks later, he flees the country. And so till this day, Moshe Machias is wanted. He's a known fugitive. This is a screenshot of the US government website. Okay, so till this day, he's a wanted fugitive in the US. Where's Moshe Machias? I found him. He's just living down the coast. He's living in Netanya. This is his apartment building. I went to his apartment. That's where he lives with his new wife and child. I went to his place of work. He's got a successful business now. He runs laser light shows and fireworks shows for events and parties. And if you can imagine this, he even amongst other groups, he did the light show for groups like the Pet Shop Boys when they perform concerts in Israel. So he's a successful businessman by any stretch. And yeah, okay, so he's a credible member of society allegedly, and admittedly he's got some connections. His uncle, Avi Machias, used to work for Israel's president, Ruvi Rivlin, in his home. So he's got what we call protexia. He's got connections that could help him get out of a bind. But so what? He is wanted in the US for serious crimes of extortion. He's a wanted fugitive, and he's just living in Israel like nothing. Okay, so he's got a big family, so what? So he's got a wife and kids, so what? Shouldn't he have to pay? And like him, I found over a dozen others like him. Also arrested as part of Stow, charged with these serious crimes, and they just fled. No one knows where they are. Each one of them has a wanted page on the US government website. And every one of them has a Facebook page in the exact same name that they were charged with, and the exact same face as their mugshot. Unabashed, not embarrassed. Openly, they don't have any fear. They're just living with total impunity. This really says something about the US-Israel relationship. And here's the kicker. This just goes over the top. So remember I said Machias was arrested in 2003, and he was the foreman of the company that, that was charged. But the owner of the company, another Israeli man, Simo Elbaz, he also was arrested, naturally. But Elbaz, after he was arrested, he didn't flee to Israel. He fled. And his newlywed wife, who had married him just a few days before his arrest, came to the court and said, I don't know where he is. He left me. He just got up and went, and I don't know what's happened to him. And so they closed the case. A couple months later, he just goes back around and returns to his wife. And ever since, he's been living with her in the exact same place at his last known location. He's living in the Miami area with that same woman that testified on his behalf that he's missing. And they're raising kids together. They've got a family, they've got a home, and they're part of their community. His son has a bar mitzvah. It's announced in the local Jewish, journal. Okay, he is a wanted fugitive, so he can't leave the country, right? He's not allowed to go to an airport because as soon as he does, they'll find out that he's a wanted fugitive, so he can't leave. So when his daughter from a previous marriage gets married in Israel, he can't come to his own daughter's wedding. So she's got to come to America to visit him. So his son graduates from the Israeli Air Force. What Zionist father wouldn't want to, be at that ceremony where his son is, graduates from the Air Force, but he can't go because he can't leave the US. He's stuck in the US, but he's living his life. So he's living under the radar, but he's living in every sense of the word.